you so much for joining the webinar on supporting multi-scalar linkages for innovation. My name is Andrea Wires, and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Manager on the Global Alliance Africa project. So just want to say thank you to everyone joining on YouTube, particularly those of you who might be joining from Nigeria, where we know that the situation is a little bit very stressful. Just to say that KTN, aligned with the UK government's position, we are deeply concerned by the reports of violence and brutality at the hands of security forces there, and we just send you all our best. So thank you for joining. If you're on YouTube, please add any questions or comments you have in the chat box beside the video. And before we kick off into our wonderful presentations that we have planned today, just like to say thank you again to our funders from the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office through UK Aid, Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy through the Global Challenges Research Fund, as well as from Innovate UK. We'd also like to thank our partners, South Africa's Technology Innovation Agency, CC Hub, Shimalongong Hub, AfriLabs, and iHub. So before we go into our presentations as well, I'll just provide a little bit of background on this webinar and the broader Global Ideas Exchange series. In March, as COVID sort of swept the globe, KTN rapidly sort of pivoted its Global Alliance Africa project to conduct a rapid analysis of the innovation ecosystem response to COVID in Africa. And through our kind of research and consultation process, we surfaced sort of 6 across different ecosystems. So those were sort of value chain disruption, constraints on funding, and challenges with connectivity infrastructure. Now, core to all of these is very much the idea of connections and where those mechanisms may have broken down. So in planning our activities for the oncoming year, we'd really like to look at how we can enhance innovative resilience in Africa through inclusive knowledge sharing, our ability to drive innovation through global alliances, and then seeing how we can build back stronger and together. So the agenda for today's session, I'm Andrea and I'm conducting this welcome. And then we'll have presentations. We've had a little bit of a change in the schedule. So we'll be starting with Takunda, who is a board member at AfriLabs, and then we'll be going on to Kamal, who is at IUBH University, formerly at Safaricom, and then when he joins Boston, we'll be speaking on behalf of CC Hub. After those presentations, I'll hand over to my colleague Sean Holmes, who is the policy lead at KTN, and then we'll wrap up. So just to say again that core to many of the challenges that we surfaced through our analysis, whether related to funding, finding partners, disrupted value chains, are the sort of knowledge and resource gaps that can occur through broken down mechanisms for communication. So that can lead to poor visibility and understanding between different innovation stakeholders and their expectations. So the key objectives for this session are to address the need for stronger multi-scalar linkages through discussion of different models for knowledge sharing and distributed resources. So now very pleased to present Takunda Chingonzo, who is, as I said, a board member of AfriLabs, but he's also the founder of the Village Innovation Network, which is a support network that focuses on innovation and technology and its ability to power organizations and communities through entrepreneurship. The Innovation Network includes organizations like Tech Village Hub and Velocity Ventures, which strive to support startups and the entrepreneurs that create them. Takunda's, as I said, sits as a board member for AfriLabs, which is a network organization of 225 technology innovation hubs spread across 47 different African countries. Just to say that Takunda has received widespread recognition for his work in empowering and driving the spirit of entrepreneurship across Africa, receiving an entrepreneurship award at the World Youth Forum in 2018 from President El-Sisi in Egypt, and has also been featured on the cover of Forbes Africa as one of its 30 under 30. So we're thrilled to have you today, Takunda, and I will give the floor to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Andrea. Hi, everybody. And it's an honor to be here to be presenting and participating in this conversation on behalf of the AfriLabs network. And like as you had already touched, the AfriLabs network is a network of over 215 innovation hubs and entrepreneurship support organizations right across the continent in about 47 different countries. We can move to the next slide. And really the goal is to try and support those who are building innovation ecosystems, the players within them, and not just the hubs, but the startups and entrepreneurs that they support, as well as bringing together the different stakeholders that are involved in this process of supporting innovation and the spirit of entrepreneurship across Africa. And I think it's ideal that this conversation is also being had, because a lot of the issues that we will discuss, affect how ecosystems are functioning across the continent. Next slide, please. So the vision of the AfriLabs network is, to build a thriving innovation economy in Africa, driven by the power of community. And so we leverage a lot on, the peer support and collaboration that happens across innovation hubs and ESOs, as well as across the different stakeholders. And we achieve this through our grand mission, which is working through policy advocacy and now, in terms of the work that AfriLabs has been doing, I just moved to the next slide. Thank you. There are a good number of programs and projects that we've been working on throughout the year. And just to briefly touch on a couple of these, the AfriLabs has been working on the capacity building program, the ACBP, which is a €2 million capacity building project, which seeks to build capacity of innovation hubs on the African continent, and it's been implemented thanks to the support of the French Development Agency, the AFD, through their Digital Africa Seed Fund. Now, what the ACBP has been able to provide is to create room to support innovation response to COVID-19. And one of the ways that we've been able to do that is by providing meetup grants for hubs, focusing on their response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and involving the startups and entrepreneurs that they work with. Over and above that, AfriLabs is involved in the Global Edtech Hub, which is a consortium of partners funded by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which was formerly DFID, as well as the World Bank and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, the EdTech Hub seeks to help improve education technology in developing countries, and AfriLabs is the regional partner of this hub. And through the work in this hub, we've been able to sort of facilitate a call for tech-focused ideas that respond to COVID-19, especially with how the education process, schools and institutions have been disrupted, and more especially when it comes to the low to medium income countries and the communities that exist there. And so there was a lot of work around understanding these ideas and figuring out how to support and scale those interventions to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic. We also worked on a rapid analysis of innovation response to COVID-19. This was I think in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, in partnership with KTN Global Alliance, where we looked at rapid analysis of the challenges and the impact and innovation response to the pandemic across the continent. And then lastly, we've been working on Project Rolo, which is essentially a business simulation, a sandbox that allows entrepreneurs to learn and to implement strategies for, recovering their businesses and building resilience through, implementing these strategies in a sandbox environment. And what we hope is that a couple of these projects and programs where resilient communities across the continent and see the recovery of the innovation ecosystems that we support in there. To the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is basically how AfriLabs engages the innovation community across the continent. Is really through these 5 different sort of core areas. We do a lot of talent and research, and I think this is a very big issue, especially when it comes to getting information accessible and having it working across multiple stakeholders, especially through the academic partnerships that we cultivate. We also do quite a bit of policy advocacy, so supporting entities and institutions that are looking at adapting the legal infrastructure that we have within the ecosystems that we're working in. We do a lot of capacity building, and I think the projects that I was speaking on just now kind of also touch on how that has been going with regards to webinars and workshops, as well as resources to increase the sustainability of our member hubs. We host a good number of events across the ecosystem, and we also collaborate with other organizations that are looking at hosting and participating in events. And lastly, we cultivate and encourage partnerships that help us the ecosystem. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the COVID response and the sort of adapting of the programs that we have been working on, we sort of highlighted a couple of challenges that I think I'll touch on briefly, as well as the lessons based on those challenges. One of the biggest issues was the poor multi-sector collaboration. And I think this kind of speaks to how centralized and almost siloed a lot of activities have been within innovation ecosystems across the continent. There's the lack of coordinated response and effective data sharing amongst stakeholders, which I think made a lot of responses and a lot of sort of program-based interventions become a challenge. There's a lot of bureaucracy and slow operational processes, as well as limited capacity building resources and opportunities within the ESOs and hubs that we work with. And then lastly, with regards to those challenges as well, there are a lot of bottlenecks in the review of government policies to interventions. From there, there are a good number of lessons that we sort of learned from that. The need to leverage on flexibility as a tool for adapting in emergencies. The quick adaptability to change, which has been key, I think, to a lot of the survival strategies that we've been talking about, whether it's at SME level or at hub level or across the ecosystem. Leveraging of local expertise, which is a more efficient way to create and sustain solutions, as well as stronger collaboration for greater efficiency and impact as well. Can we move to the next slide? Now, the approaches to responding and to supporting COVID-19 recovery. I think the first and foremost is really reframing the pandemic as a positive opportunity. So accepting those changes as a positive opportunity and embracing the flexibility, as I was speaking on just now. The reduction of bureaucracy in internal systems and processes, which is, I think, a key element that can be adopted, across the board as well, from small businesses that are trying to adapt their processes to larger entities within the ecosystems, all the way up to the bureaucratic processes within national systems as well. Into organizational image, analyzing and leveraging on existing data, and again also being more open in the collaboration around the on the short-term response, making sure that we can accelerate the work that is being done in that space, whilst also planning for a longer-term recovery, building resilience for sustainability, and building synergies with multi-sectoral collaboration, which promotes inclusiveness in itself. Next slide, please. Now, we believe, there are a lot of opportunities for stronger collaboration as well. The international collaboration on key areas around, health science and technology, as well as research and knowledge sharing amongst key stakeholders. I think making that data and information more accessible in almost a real-time manner sort of aids in key data-driven decision making. Collaborating between development agencies and local innovation support leaders to launch new initiatives or scale existing ones in support of COVID-19 recovery. And I think this is very, very key because it localizes the interventions and gets more buy-in, which overall increases the success of those interventions. And lastly, collaboration between innovation policy drivers and governments to review policies to support innovations for future resilience. I think this is very, very key in the sense that there are a lot of key learnings we've had to learn as we were implementing multiple projects and multiple interventions. And it's the matter of abstracting those and ensuring that we are able to adapt the legal infrastructure that we have so as to make sure that we become more responsive in the future and again build more resilience. Next slide, please. So thank you very much.
It looks like
that's just a brief sort of a presentation from my end. Detail in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kunda. I think we lost you a little bit there, the audio a couple times, but thank you for that very, very interesting presentation. It was wonderful to hear about the different sort of the multi-pronged approach, but also the very holistic approach that AfriLabs takes to support its members and other ecosystem actors in terms of its collaboration internationally and locally. So thank you very much for that. Now hand over to Kamal Bhattacharya, who is a professor for computer science at IUBH International University. Oops, my screen is frozen. He is also the co-founder and CEO of Mojo Chat, a startup focused on communication skills for development. Kamal spent most of his professional career in applied R&D across the US, Asia, and Africa. And before his current roles, he served as Chief Innovation Officer at Safaricom and was the inaugural Director and Vice President at IBM Research in Africa. He's also served as a commissioner of the Pathways for Prosperity Commission on Technology and Inclusive Development, a senior lecturer at MIT Sloan Business School, and acting CEO of iHub in Nairobi, as well as country manager for the International Growth Center in Kenya. So I will hand the floor to you.
Okay, so now I think I'm unmuted. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you to the team, KTN, to having me here. It's a real pleasure, and I'm excited to hear about all the great ideas. And then sort of, I haven't met Takunda yet, but you know, to just see sort of, we have probably so many folks that he works with that I used to work with, especially at the iHub. It's kind of great to connect and reconnect at the same time. I wanted to, you know, just look at this whole question that we are discussing here from the perspective of innovation resilience. You know, at the end of the day, you know, all of us who've been either entrepreneurs or who are in the support infrastructure for entrepreneurship, which is where, you know, I have spent some of my time on in Kenya and also in several other countries in Africa. You know, we always have to ask ourselves the question, you know, what is it that entrepreneurship should really drive? And, you know, to me personally, as a, you know, a struggling entrepreneur, as struggling as you can be, if I would known it before, I wouldn't have done it, kind of struggling, right? So, and the key question that you always think about, that every entrepreneur thinks about, is that, you know, are you making a difference to anyone's life? That is there something that you are providing that makes somebody's life better, you know, cheaper, better for them personally or for an organization? And if the answer to this is, of course, yes, then the next question is the commercial question, which is, are they willing? Is it so important to them that they are willing to pay for it? And are they able to pay for it, which I think is a really important question to keep in mind when we are talking about emerging economies and when we are talking about countries which have significant disparity in income structures. And this is kind of what drives, I think, a lot of the discussion around innovation resilience, because to enable an infrastructure for people like you and me, like anyone, to take a risk, there are obviously a multitude of factors necessary other than an entrepreneur being ingenious or somebody having a good idea or good connections or, for that matter, just money. There are many different things that are required. And what I have experienced myself in sort of my support roles that I played for the majority of my time in Africa has always been that there is a multitude of aspects that you look at right now that you feel have kind of broken down during COVID. But the reality, of course, is they were broken before, right? A lot of things sort of accelerate over time and get in some situations get exacerbated, through a pandemic. But others, like access to funding, access to data, value chains, and all that, has always been very, very complicated in a continent with 54 regulators. That has never been easy. It's always been hard. And COVID, of course, hasn't made any things better. And the only thing that we need to think about is that, what is the role of entrepreneurship? And I loved kind of Takunde's presentation, because I think what he really brought out is sort of the on-the-ground view of an organization that does the only right thing, which is building strong networks across the continent, right, across the different regions, and trying to pull together resources and also distribute resources in a way that we don't forget that the big opportunity in Africa comes in a Pan-African viewpoint, not in an individual country viewpoint. And having worked for a multinational company for many years, also in Kenya, the reality is that the markets are small, even though some of the markets are now growing and being significant. And Safaricom again is a great example of how a company can drive significant change to the population and also be incredibly profitable and big. However, these are exceptional. I would say these are exceptional circumstances, right? The reality is going to be that the networks across different African regions are going to make the region stronger. The second question, of course, that we also need to understand is what are the sort of institutional infrastructure aspects that need to be in place. And while I was working with people like Strive Mosia, who was very passionate about entrepreneurship in Africa, and also Melinda Gates and Christoph Durkin from Oxford, who used to be the head of DFID, and many other partners on the Pathways for Prosperity. I think especially the research team in Oxford has done a great job to understand and formulate how should a digital compact, especially with focus on digitization, of course, for inclusive development actually look like? What are some of the key parameters? So that when we negotiate sort of resilient networks, we gain a shared understanding between different key stakeholders to navigate, quite frankly, a really, really complex trade-off, right? I've learned working with the government of Kenya and with other governments in Africa that, there are always tendencies and local perspectives that come first, because as a politician, as a policymaker, you will report back to your constituency. But at the same time, the strength of Africa has always been, is going to continue to be, how much different countries can set themselves apart as a unit. Not necessarily Pan-African, but especially regional. And there we've seen that sometimes we have to have a better understanding, especially when we look into digital services that drive significant growth, like financial services, education, edtech, these kinds of things, to navigate these complex trade-offs. And so a couple of the points that we learned in our engagement with a variety of governments, not just in Africa, but also across other developing regions, is that we have to learn to put the people at the center of a digital future. Right? We need to understand how do we develop skills based on the future needs in a digital world. This is changing dramatically, and we hear this all the time. But when I look at all the trends that I have missed while I was still deeply involved in the kind of broader African community in technology, I'm astounded myself. I would not have predicted certain things to happen at this pace, and this is only going to get faster and faster. We need to also not just think about universities and businesses, but also about vocational training and apprenticeship models, because the skills development parts, entrepreneurship happens much more just a layer below digitization, but that layer is digitizing as well. And of course, understanding how do we create in that context social protection programs for the poorest. One of the calls to action that we have been giving in the Pathways for Prosperity was to build the digital essentials. And we created sort of a toolkit that allowed people to understand what are the foundational digital systems that from a government side we actually need to implement. And also how do we use mechanisms to de-risk entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship in Africa, entrepreneurship is risky anywhere, but especially risky in countries where fallback mechanisms may not be there compared to, say, for example, a place like Germany. And then the next part, of course, is the reaching everyone with digital technology. One of the beauties that I have noticed with M-Pesa is that, when you think about it, M-Pesa is not just reaching the poor, it's reaching everyone. Whether you are in the middle class, whether you are a subsistence farmer, you are using M-Pesa because that service makes so much sense and it's making your life easier. It's providing a real value, and you are actually willing to pay whatever that cost is that comes through accessing the transaction. I wouldn't say this was built this way. Of course, there's a lot of luck, but we have blueprints from several services that have been so ubiquitous and that have been successful at any level. And we need to think about this first and need to understand much more deeply what are the design patterns behind it, so that we don't marginalize on rollout, which happens a lot as well. And create sort of innovation sandbox. And this is the last point that I wanted to raise. I think we've seen this now in a variety of countries, that we are starting in specific areas, typically driven by financial services. But we also need to start this in the edtech sector and the education sector. We need to build sandboxes for innovation. And these sandboxes, in my mind, should be part of these more Pan-African organizations like AfriLabs, or we have Bosom now here, with CC Lab, which is now spanning several countries as well. I think these kinds of efforts need to be there, that we can experiment with innovation, and that the governments can also watch how innovation is unfolding and participate in how it is unfolding to catch up with regulations or to support those things with regulations. We've been trying this in Kenya while I was still living there. Many a times, unfortunately, is one of the many things I failed on. But we had gotten very close with the financial services sector, especially, to say, let us try digital currencies. Let's get some entrepreneurs together with central bank authorities to deeply understand how regulation will be affected. I still haven't given up on this, and I'm still sort of behind the scenes working on some efforts, both in Nigeria and some other places to drive this. But I think innovation sandboxes will be a benefit to all of them, and maybe that one thing that will help to actually create a digital compact for inclusive development across Africa. So let me thank you again, and this is all I had to say.
Thank you so much, Kamal. A lot of really interesting points there, and I'm sure Sean will pick them up in the Q&A, particularly around the innovation sandboxes. But I think you also hit a really important point there as well, where with COVID sort of crashing straight into systems already in motion and accelerating many of the processes already in place. So hopefully we'll pick more of that up in the Q&A. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Bosin Tijani has also joined us. He is the founder, and he's a co-founder and CEO of CC Hub. Oh, lost my screen there for a second. Apologies, having some technical difficulties on my side. Lost Zoom. Apologies, everybody, while I get my screen back. Sorry, can everybody still hear me? Sincere apologies to all of the panelists. I hope everyone can still hear me. Speaker, he is the co-founder and chief executive of Co-Creation Hub, a Pan-African innovation enabler working at the forefront of accelerating the application of innovation and social capital for a better society. Boston is an innovation expert on a mission to drive the application of science and technology for enterprise and economic prosperity across Africa. He has been celebrated locally and globally as the leader and initiator of the Yaba Technology Cluster and as one of New Africa Magazine's 100 most influential people on the continent. I will hand the floor over to you, Boston. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Andrea. I think that was going to be mouthful, trying to get through all of that. It's a pleasure to be here. You know, 10 years ago when we started CCO, when people ask me, you know, what are you projecting? I tell them, you know, I look forward to the day when innovation becomes so mainstream in Africa and is central to how we do everything we do. I think as you're gonna see from my slide, if we go to the first slide, as you probably get to see, you will see the typical thing that you see when we have conversation about Africa, which are, you know, obvious challenges. Population growth. You know, we've seen so many people being vocal about this, including even presidents of countries calling out the continent that this is going to be a disaster. If you want to talk about education, we have over 20% primary school kids that are out of school, 30% secondary school age children also out of school. If you want to talk about public health, you know, you can probably see so many things to say about the poor health system on the continent, with average life expectancy being at 53. You can imagine how extremely annoying that is. If we go to the next slide, you know, the challenges with Africa is not going to stop. You also can see rapid urbanization, which in itself is a big problem, right? 40% of Africans now live in urban areas. You know, 51% of the population, but it's expected to be, you know, living in urban area by 2040. And some of the obvious one is even in governance, safety and rule of law, you know, being a big issue. Participation and human rights also issue, but also human development as well, if you look at all the indexes. But, you know, depending on who you are and where you sit, Africa is that continent that is also full of tremendous and immense opportunities as well. So if we move on to the next slide, and this is where the juice is, you know, this is where the juice is. Being able to see that this is a continent that is on the path to prosperity. Let's move to the next slide, please. You know, where you see that the working age population and job creation, in terms of by 2034, Africa is expected to have the world's largest working age population on the continent. Urbanization that is meant to become an issue is actually going to become opportunity, because it means that we can then begin to create you know, tremendous opportunities for all these people in the urban area as we create jobs. You know, spending capital then will go up, obviously. But also it doesn't stop there, because Africa is typically a continent that people talk about the huge infrastructure deficit. It means that we also have the opportunity to build our infrastructure in really new ways without being saddled with the pain that comes with legacy infrastructure. You know, if you look at Europe, for instance, where telecommunications is quite advanced, Some of the things we're able to do in Africa is not going to come easy in continents with very deep existing infrastructure. So tech can enable more opportunities also in the workforce. If we move to the next slide, in this next slide, we're then expecting that there is opportunity for us to create, over the past 5 years, actually 21 million jobs have been reported to have been created. This is statistics from the World Economic Forum. 2 trillion in spending is being projected by 2025. So if the people within the economy and the economy itself is able to encourage 2 trillion in spending, you can imagine how much opportunity exists in there for businesses. But also you can also see that penetration of smartphone. It's not the same as well-developed society, because what we do with smartphones in Africa is different from what people do with smartphones in so many other places. So you can all the challenges, if that's what you want to see, that's obvious. But you can also see that the opportunity blessed. This is not just talking about technology, because technology is exciting. If we move to the next slide, but it's talking about technology and innovation, from the perspective that the opportunity that, next slide, please, that the opportunity that exists for Africa have been said to be in some critical sectors like agriculture, banking, consumer groups, infrastructure, mining, oil and gas, and telecommunications. But the challenge here is that for us to leapfrog, the opportunities that will come from these sectors, for us to be able to make good out of them, that we need to be looking at how do we use digital transformation to scale the opportunities that exist in all of these different sectors. Because on their own, what drives competitiveness within them is not going to come from just mere doing agriculture the normal way, but the ability to apply technical efficiency in each of these areas is what will drive productivity for the continent. If we move to the next slide, and what you then begin to see for those who may be economists in the room is, how you really measure the level of productivity in any society is through total factor productivity, right? Which is that portion that you can't explain, which is where technical efficiency comes to play. And what we're saying here is innovation becomes the only way. I say this and I say it with everything that I have, even when you think of poor governance or you think of public health or education. Innovation is the only way through which Africa can quickly leapfrog. That for every sector in which we have possible potential competitive advantage, that the only way we're going to lift opportunities in those sectors will be through technical efficiency. And clear ways of driving technical efficiency will be through innovation. It will be through using technology to drive economic growth. And that's how we're going to build economic prosperity. This graph may not do justice to the depth of the work that has been going, but I've just decided to pick a few examples of how you're beginning to see smart application of technology in critical sectors in Africa. Whether you talk about agriculture and you see what people are doing in that space. If you talk about Twiga food, which is quite strong in Kenya, or you talk about farm crowding in Nigeria. In the public health space, for instance, if you look at the work that people like LifeBank, which is from Nigeria, or Flair, that is from Kenya, the work they're doing, they're bringing innovation really to the table to change the delivery of public health services in these countries. And some of them are now beginning to expand into more African countries. If you talk about logistics and value chain, you can talk about the work that Kobo 360 and Lorry System is doing. If you go all the way to Rwanda, you look at what Zipline is doing in innovating and using drones to move medical supplies all across the key parts of the country. You start to see how innovation is critical to how Africa can quickly solve some of the many problems that we're facing. So it becomes clearer to you that what is happening in Africa today is not just people in Africa jumping on the bandwagon, but the creative people, the private sector, beginning to realize that they have a role to play in leapfrogging the development of that continent using true technical efficiency, and innovation needs to drive that. But this is what we need to watch out for, and I think this is the main cruise of my presentation. The next slide. when you talk about innovation, and I think KTN will know this quite well, the offering and the prescription from more developed society will tell you that you need to ensure that you build up your national innovation systems to be very, very deep. So how do you ensure that you have all the critical organizations to knowledge generation that can contribute into invention, that can contribute into commercialization of knowledge? How do you have policies and laws in place? How do you have systems? How do you have government entities? How do you have investors in place who can support the drive for innovation? And that prescription would typically come from the national innovation system thinking. This is quite well embedded in economic development as well. But what we're seeing from Africa today, unfortunately, is that it's not easy for you to just conduct this, where you expect that policy can be mobilized and transferred. Way national innovation system is perceived in the UK or US is the same way it's going to grow for Africa, because Africa has had these years of all these key infrastructures not being there, which means that Africa needs to find a different way of developing. And I think the response that you've seen over the last 10 years on the continent, if we move to the next slide, is actually something that is totally different. So Africa has been building a different kind of innovation system. And at the core of this different kind of innovation system are all the technology hubs. These are the popular hubs. When we started CC Hub, iHub started in, I think, March 2010. We started about October 2010, just a few months. There were a couple of handful of hubs on the continent. But today, I think we have thousands of them. A lot of these organizations meet different needs. They provide different services within their national innovation system of the countries in which they operate, but also within the innovation system that supports innovation across the continent. Some of them are quite basic as being tech hubs, but some are more sophisticated to the point where they now invest. You have some that are sophisticated to the point where they're now doing research and development. You're also seeing amalgamations of hubs on the continent, where over the last 10 years, we've learned quite a lot. We've learned things that work, those that doesn't work. We've seen hubs that are not having direct value, but they still bring something to their ecosystem. And what you now see is that based on these movements, there's more resources that is coming into the African continent that is actually supporting the drive to power innovation. And it is based on this prescription. We started seeing results in Nigeria. A company was announced last week to have exited to Stripe for $200 million US. We started seeing acquisition. We started seeing strong exit on the continent. You're going to start to see an ecosystem that understands what it takes to fund innovation. It will take a while, but I think the last 10 years has built the foundation for that. But this is the point where I then propose, and in line with the topic of this panel conversation or this conversation, where I propose what I call the network approach to national innovation system. If we can go to the next slide, that Africa doesn't need to think of innovation system the same way it's been thought of in developed countries, or the same way it was being pushed, as a model that needs to be copied. But Africa needs to take a network approach to thinking about its innovation system. And the core reason for that is the fact that knowledge today, in the new era, is embedded in network, right? It is embedded in network. You can also see this from the fact that there's obviously rapid proliferation of information and knowledge. Before, say 20, 30 years ago, for you to be competitive in a particular industry, you must have internal strengths and capacity to do research and development in that particular industry. But we saw over the last 10, 15 years, the emergence of open innovation, which says not everything needs to come from within your organization, which says you can tap into knowledge from outside of your organization. It's the same thinking that Africa needs to look at. How do we partner with organizations and nations where knowledge transfer can be used to drive innovation on the continent? Our universities may not be generating enough knowledge, but if you look at the UK, for instance, there are tons of research results sitting on shelves at universities that are not being used. What sort of relationships can we build around key sectorial areas that can help to drive innovation in key sectors in Africa? And as we're doing that, how do we then start to build our own capacity locally as well? So you can drive innovation through that means, instead of waiting for the research institutions in Africa to to be at a place where they can do the innovation. Also, knowledge in this new era is located in a web of relationships, right? Which is why network is also quite important. If you look at the bulk of the startups that have been founded on the continent, a lot of them raise their capital from outside of Africa. You know, there's been stories around how DFID played a major role in M-Pesa. You know, I wasn't there. I don't know how much, you know, of fact that is. But there's that story that DFID played a major role in that. You know, most of the startup I work with, they raise money from outside of the continent. IOP that we acquired was founded by Eric, you know, who also has strong network and relationship from outside of the continent. CCOP's first funding came from a media network, which is a US entity. So Africa needs to start to see its innovation system from that perspective, where we can build relationships and network and allies and leverage resources from outside of the continent, you know, learn it or what we have internally to build opportunities for the continent. And also the last part of it is that, you know, the knowledge in new era is also transmitted within network as well. If you have network for critical industry, critical sectors on the continent, knowledge can easily be transmitted within this network way faster than it would have been done in traditional national innovation system setting. So if we look at innovation system from a network approach, we can then start to say public health needs to be supported. How do we build a network around that, whereby knowledge can transmit, resources can move easily, and you're driving innovation within public health across Africa without waiting for the entire national innovation system to be strong. I'll move to my last slide because I think I've taken quite a bit of time. But lastly, we need to look different sense, and we need to look at it as a path to collective prosperity as well. Path to collective prosperity also partners and organizations and continents who partner with Africa as well. You know, I don't think Africa can sustain its competitiveness by getting into relationships that are based on handouts, you know, development on the continent. What's going to drive development on the continent is relationships that are based on Africa being able to add value to other countries, you know, and continents, but also other continents being able to add value to Africa as well. But when you also look at this distributed innovation system approach internally as well, so if you take that network approach, where it takes you is a distributed innovation system approach as against national innovation system. And what this is going to enable is that it will strengthen the ability to form network around key industries, key technological area that can drive development on the continent. You ultimately be building mutual benefit, which is what I mentioned before, that, you know, countries are not partnering with African countries just because it's interesting to help African countries because they are poor, but because there's a business opportunity in actually partnering with these countries and by driving innovation in them. And lastly, is that when we take a distributed approach to innovation system, it eliminates the barrier to membership and growth dynamic as well. And by barrier to membership, it means that, you know, opportunity to innovate and leverage what comes out of an innovation system is not only limited to organizations with access. You know, network is done in such a way that once it's distributed, you don't need to go through that, you know, very structured level that needs to start from the top, that needs to move downward. You don't need to wait for the local institutions to be able to just drive innovation. You can drive innovation through network. You can drive innovation through relationships. And you can drive innovation by using these relationships to also encourage local capacity to develop as well. I think this is where I'll stop for now. Hopefully there'll be questions for me and the previous speakers as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Boston. That was an incredibly interesting presentation. I think I'll probably save my comments so we can go straight into the discussion, because I think there's a lot to unpack there, particularly just, you know, relationship building at different scales to tunnel through the kind of maybe rigid structures that have developed in the West. But I will pass over to Sean to maybe kick off that discussion. But thank you again to all the presentation panelists there. Sean, I'll hand off to you.
Okay, Thank you, Andrea. Thank you to all three speakers that we've had today. Some absolutely fascinating points. I've been scribbling away furiously here, and I've got lots of questions that I want to ask you as well. And I've seen that the questions coming in from YouTube have been appearing as well. So I'm going to go through some of those. Reflecting on the talks that we've had so far, we've put a lot of emphasis on the network approach. Obviously, given who we've got on the call, that's coming out as a very strong aspect. And I'm very intrigued by this need as well that's come up quite strongly for breaking out of the individual countries and operating on a pan-African scale. Now, one thing that occurs to me, and obviously I work in this area as well, is that we have a very difficult role to play in managing these networks to cover what we call innovation support. And innovation support is like can cover every single sector, every single possible technology. So when we are looking, or when we're looking to interact with government, when we're making the links between innovators who are working on thousands of different innovative projects, and we're wanting to try and make those links with government, how do we effectively manage that process so that we can not confuse the government policymakers? Everyone that we've got on this call is worked around networks, has worked in the innovation industry in specific sectors or managing networks. And but many of the policymakers that we might be interacting with have specific backgrounds, specific remits. How do we make that a connection between clearly, so that policymakers can make sense of the messages that are coming in from diverse networks? I'll put that first, since we've just heard from Bosun. I'll give the floor back to Bosun just to comment on that, and then maybe if we can get a quick response from the other speakers as well.
That's an interesting question, Sean, and I think it's also one that, the way you presented it obviously is a challenge for organizations like KTN, but I actually also think it speaks to what we may have been doing wrongly, in my opinion. And the reason for that is when you look at the way innovation is structured in countries like, say, Nigeria, or most African countries, or every country in the world, to be honest, there's an assumption that within government, there's one single entity that is responsible for driving innovation policy across all the critical sector. And that assumption is even more pronounced today because of digital technology. So because digital cut across every sector that you look at. So whenever we talk about innovation, those in charge of digital often end up being the ones we engage. But I've seen the situation in my country, or in most African countries, where we need serious innovation in agriculture. But if you're speaking to the digital guys, you're not necessarily getting to the bottom of what needs to be done to drive innovation in agriculture. If you get into public health, for instance, this pandemic was a great example of how innovation in public health, as much as digital technologies can drive innovation within public health, what actually makes innovation happen? Then the frontline workers, they're the public health folks in government and private sector that are responsible for delivering public health services within the countries. So what network approach brings to these? And the question perhaps will be, shouldn't we be focusing on how we help build and animate network? The focus should be on the composition of network and what flows within the different actors of the network. If we do a good job as understanding what the network for innovation for critical sectors like public health or agriculture or even manufacturing should look like, we would have ended up ensuring that the right government parastatals or entities are also part of those specific networks. And by the time we're now focusing on the flows of what goes on within the relationships within this network, you will find that the guys who need to know about it need to know about it. And your work then becomes a lot lighter because your focus is not on saying, going to lobby for what government needs to know, but ensuring that the network is built appropriately and the flow of the content of what's within the network is appropriate as well. I don't know if I managed to answer the question, but
no, I think you give some very good a good answer, a good starting point on that point. I'd actually maybe just ask Takunda, maybe for your opinion on that. What has AfriLabs done? Maybe with some examples of to bring in the right kind of government representatives to make sure that you've got things like regulation aligned, the right priorities placed on emerging innovations. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about what you've done there.
Sure, and I totally agree with what Boston was talking about. I think across the board, there is the need to ensure that the right stakeholders within the ecosystem, within the communities, are involved in the conversation. I think there's also a very great deal in ensuring that the information about the conversation is packaged in a language and in a structure that all the stakeholders actually understand. Because where that lack of understanding happens, you cannot expect any form of collaboration to happen. From the AfriLabs network perspective, I know there's a lot of policy advocacy that has been done by a good number of member organizations. Partners like the IFO Policy have been doing a lot of community awareness and getting hubs and entrepreneurship support organizations to understand and build capacity to be able to start having these conversations. We have the Lawyers Hub in Kenya that has been doing that, and there's been a lot of discourse around the Startup Act in Kenya as well. But I think really at the fundamental root of it, and even as a network across a couple of countries, it's difficult to, and it's probably even wrong in its actual sense, to try and summarize to say this is kind of what this looks like, because it is largely also country specific. But I think at the root core of it is the need to be able to package and communicate across that board in a manner that gets everybody in discussing it and talking.
Okay. Yes, I think that's a really valuable point actually there. I think, that way of making things specific to the different cultures, to the different countries, I think is a really key point. And what I'd like to do, maybe we'll come to Kamal for your opinion on that broader point. But actually, one of the things that we're getting coming in a lot from the comments, one of the I guess favorite topics that seems to be arising is how do we make sure that is looking at that divide between rural and urban. So, when you were talking, Kamal, earlier, very interested to hear when you were talking about M-Pesa and the reasons for the success of these kind of this technology, this innovation. Was it's almost like the fact that it's got a universal appeal, that the market base for it is huge. It covers not just poorer parts of society or those geographically distributed around the country, but everyone. And that's one of the reasons why it was so successful, was because it had that use. But this is so. At the end of his talk, Bosun talked a little bit about the link between DFID or DFID's role within that at the beginning, and I guess you've probably got a bit more knowledge on that than the rest of us. But so when we look at the way that we can connect to the right kind of policymakers, the people that are going to provide the funding to get some of these innovations going, how do we form that communication? But maybe if you could talk a little bit more on that area of the links between rural and people that are not, that are maybe sometimes a little sidelined by innovation support.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the discussion before. Why is Germany, one of the richest countries in the world, so behind in digitization? Because there is no central ownership in government. There are 17 project groups across 11 ministries, and everyone is trying to do something, their little fiefdom in terms of how to digitize this country, one of the richest countries in the world, right? I miss my internet in Kenya. That was good internet, right? This here is not good internet. I think in Kenya, people have done a better job in sort of switching over to online education than we have here in Germany. So it's interesting. It's a valid point, right? I mean, there's something to be thought about in terms of, how well coordinated can a government actually be to drive a particular singular goal. And on the innovation side, right? I tell you what I think one of the biggest disfavors to countries were. I was actually kind of for some time a fanboy of ease of doing business. And it failed for all the right reasons in some ways, but it did something really good. It gave people a measuring stick across different verticals, registering a business, access to electricity, water, this, that, blah, blah. But then read the fine print, right? The fine print said, well, this all works out for a business that already has $1 million in recurring revenue, at least 50 staff members, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these are not really small businesses in the African context, right? Generating $1 million of revenue is a lot of money for any region, but especially for a lot of the ecosystems that we have in Africa. So the question to me is, how do we create an ease of doing investment model for the different African regions, right? Where we actually give entrepreneurs also the tools to say, here's how you start the business, here's how you invest into the country, here's how you stay in Nigeria, here's how an American investor or European investor has a better way of supporting, because we have made sure that several things will fall into place, right? We don't do that. We don't scale down, right? We don't do what M-Pesa has successfully done in Kenya, which is not just stop at something that has already been achieved, where people have gone through all the tribes and tribulation to hit that certain level, like $1 million of recurring revenue, and then everything underneath, well, that's a different process. And we never made the effort to actually think about what is that different process, right? And what do governments actually have to do, and how do you create somebody in the government? It can't be ICT ministries. They're usually not structured this way, right? It needs to be a ministry that has something to do, industrialization, finance, whoever it is, somebody who has voting power within the government and who is not just a nice to have. No offense to anyone who works in an ICT ministry, but you see, it's much more of a broader point. And to your second point, I wish I would have the design secret to the success of M-Pesa, because I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you guys. I'd be sitting somewhere in Nigeria or Kenya and running a multi-million-dollar business of sorts, right? So I don't have the design secret to it. But I think that there are a couple of things that I sort of reflect on. I mean, while working at Safaricom and before that at the iHub and IBM, it's a thought that always went through my mind. One of the things, and yes, DFID actually gave the first grant to Vodafone to start the initial project, which then the then CEO of Safaricom picked up and basically said, "Look, guys, let's do it. Let's do it here with Safaricom," and had the smarts to kind of really get it out there, and then also business enable, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a good story, right? An external organization helped jumpstart an incredibly valuable and profitable business. But think about it this way. I'll show you, instead of saying, here's how it worked, because it's also luck, it's smarts. I mean, Safaricom so far had incredible CEOs with incredible businessmen, as well as sort of personalities, a good understanding of the environment. But here's another thing. Let me show you the different example, right? So if I look at any innovation that has been done, not just in Africa, but across developing countries in education, access to educational resources, trying to do things that can work for people in rural areas, for people who have limited access, et cetera, et cetera. These are all tools that I would not give to my son, who's 10 years old. They are not educational resources that are good enough for my children. Entrepreneurs just like me, who come from similar backgrounds as I, they'll think that it's totally okay to sometimes create things that should be fine for people who live in the rural areas, right? But they're not fine for their own children, right? Because their own children need to go to public schools or to private schools, and you're willing to invest a lot of money into it. There is a disparity in the way how we look at things. One of the things that M-Pesa did well is to say, okay, what's the minimum device? What's the common denominator of everything? Well, it's SMS. So let's do this with SMS, right? Today, the next generation of any of these tools will be WhatsApp enabled or something like this, which I also unsuccessfully tried. So there's going to be something a level higher, which will give me more integration with more tools, and it still will bridge into rural areas. So what we need to think about, for example, in the edtech sector, is what are some of the mechanisms in terms of driving quality education into rural areas that from a cost point, as well as from a quality perspective, will work also for my own child. And I have brought this up in many different high-level sort of meetings, and I always get a lot of flack for this statement because it seems like I'm being condescending to all the good edtech efforts that are going on. I'm just being realistic. I care a lot about the education of my son, and I have looked at all of these things because my thought is if there is something that I can use to help my kid, then I do it. And whenever I see something that says, no, I wouldn't give it to him, then I ask myself the question, why would I want to give this to kids in rural areas who are equally deserving as my kid is, right? So the design understandings of this need to bridge that gap between people who live in urban areas, in semi-urban areas, and rural areas in such a way that as an entrepreneur and as a policymaker, I'm not creating a multi-class system. I'm creating one system that I can scale, which is why schools, by the way, are so successful, right? Because their curriculum scales. So we need to rethink that from that level. What is the right thing to do that gives me affordable access everywhere for any kind of solution, but that can be used by anyone? And that's a tricky problem, much, much trickier. And I've spent a lot of time thinking through this, given that I'm in edtech now as well, that demands much more time than I have.
So that was a very pertinent observation. And I think one almost associated feature that draws it into the I guess the multi-scalar linkages discussion is including, like, if you want to ensure that that you're maintaining a high standard, this is something that you would use, and not have this position where the innovation is for something that your consideration for other people, something for other people to use, and it's something that you. I think the an important way of getting that to work effectively within a network is to make sure that you've got an inclusive network, that you've got those perspectives, you've got those people feeding in and building on and providing their perspectives in terms of what's a high quality thing, what do we need, what's the best thing. Let's all get excited about this together. And so that I'd maybe like to put this question to one of the guys from Afilabs or CC Hub. What do we do to make sure that we have that penetration, to make sure that we are including people in the networks where maybe there's not initially an obvious reason to include them? Maybe we could think to ourselves, this is something that we need to work with other technicians, businesses, financiers, the government to provide the regulations. But what about the informal sector? What about the end users that might not be? How do we get their perspective into our networks? Bosun, do you want to maybe go ahead and try and?
Absolutely, Sean. It's a fantastic question. You're talking about this innovation systems thing and network, which is where I think I am at the minute. I think Africa has gone past just conversation around digital technology and startups as being innovation. I think we've done that for the last 10 years. What we need to do to unlock the real value and benefit of innovation that we're driving on the continent is to be able to see beyond the technology in itself. We understand that technology needs to go into everything. And from my experience, which is what we're now building at CCO, we're spinning how we build support for innovation and entrepreneurs. So I'll give an example. We did some work with the only medical research institute in Nigeria 2 years ago, before the pandemics, before anyone knew Corona was a thing. And what they were trying to do was focus on epidemiology, but we started with tuberculosis. And they were trying to look for ways to use digital technologies to improve how surveillance and detection of spread of tuberculosis was growing in Nigeria. So we decided there was a need for us to automate the system that they use in managing patients. So they have this test center in the middle of Lagos. And we built this lovely technology solution we gave to them. But all the staff refused to use it. The frontline health workers refused to use this technology because for them, there was a process that they believed was tied to the paper form. And we couldn't make sense out of it until we got to the point where two gentlemen came for testing for tuberculosis. They collected their sample, they left. By the time the result came out, they both tested positive for a very annoying strain of TB. And by the time they picked up the form and started to call them, they realized that the phone number and the home address that has been given was false. So they couldn't locate these guys. So there were these people on the street of Lagos infecting other people with TB, which is something the government had been spending serious money to reduce. And this was the point where, for me, I realized that if we're driving innovation, we need to be engaging the people you're talking about, because it's one thing for people to create the sexy solutions. And in Africa, the problem is not ideas, but the problem is around the ecosystem surrounding the problem that you're trying to solve. Great ideas are commonplace across the continent, but the problem is the ecosystem around the problems you're trying to solve. Whether you take education, for instance, if you pick education, you can't get most great edtech solutions to scale because governments still control education. And you'll quickly find that even in cases where you want to bypass government, the infrastructure that you need to do that does not exist, right? It's the same in public health, it's the same in agriculture. So I think it's a no-brainer that we need to bring those people. And I think it's the work that we need to do to unlock the next level for innovation to create the value that we want to see on the continent. How do we start to think of building network around problems? And this is what we do at CC Hub now. We have a dedicated practice for public health. There's no startup that we support in public health that doesn't have the right and access to government approval, because we've created the network around us. We have folks from the government, we have investors, we have people like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They're very aware of the work we do. MEC for Mothers, Clinton Health Alliance. So we've created that network not only just because it's fun, but by the time we're investing in any health tech startup, they have all the access to relationships and network that they need to be able to scale, to be able to understand the issue. So I can't tell you that this is how we need to do it, but that's the work that needs to be done. We're already doing it in education. CC Hub invested in an innovation center in the first University of Education in Nigeria, not because we're going to be making money out of it, but because we understand that there's empirical information that our startups will need to be able to do good jobs. So we've done this we've done the same in governance where we work with government. In Nigeria, the last major elections, CC Hub built a platform that the government was promoting for citizens to understand how to get access to information on where to vote, how to vote, and things like that. CC Hub incubated the best, transparency startup in Nigeria and one of the best in Africa, which is Budget. These we built based on building network, and that's the value that you get from network. If we need to take innovation to the next level, the sort of people you're talking about, Sean, we need to understand how to access them. We need to understand which government entities are responsible for these people. The hard work is in getting these partners to see why innovation is important and the role that it can play within the ecosystem.
Thank you, Bosun. Yeah, really insightful comments. I'd love to talk about this for much longer. We're running out of time. I can't believe how quickly it's going. We've got about 10 minutes of discussion left. What I would want to do is maybe just like move it on to there's a couple of different questions actually I want to cover before we close out. And the first one I'll hand over to Takunda maybe to answer this. And this is something that came in through the chat on, it kind of goes, it's almost building on from what we've just been talking about, but it's really much more focused on on overcoming or tackling the digital divide. So this is a much more of a practical, I think Takunda might have gone actually or dropped off. Maybe I think he's been having some internet problems. So maybe I'll put this one back to Kamal. Oh no, actually, maybe. Well, whoever wants to take this question up, you can come to it. Just maybe quickly, if we can just touch on that challenge of the digital divide within society from a practical standpoint. So, what have we done? Are you aware of what anyone's done to overcome that, or what have you done in your own organizations? Because it is central. It's like a practical barrier towards actually engaging with large parts of these populations that we've been talking about. Don't know if you want to take up that. I feel that maybe Bosun might be, I'll come back to you, Kamal, for the very last question. But Bosun, maybe if you want to answer that reasonably quickly, and then we'll move on to the next question.
I think it's a conundrum. It's a conundrum in the sense that we always have this challenge because obviously we still have infrastructure not being at the level which it should be on the continent. And there's always this conversation around how we need to build solution that doesn't require the level of sophistication when it comes to the backbone infrastructure that you need. And I've been in this space now. I've seen startups that have attempted to actually dumb down their solutions because they want to be able to reach markets that are not connected. And a lot of the time they actually do fail. That's what you tend to see. So you see someone going into the rural area, there's no internet, and they're finding alternative ways to actually deliver on-demand services. They end up failing in most cases. That's actually what I've seen. Because what we tend to forget about digital technologies is that what we've been able to enable is that opportunity from one to many, but also the opportunity for real-time feedback as well, the opportunity for connectivity and what that can enable. When a rural area is connected to the internet and they can feed back information real-time, or someone can collect information from them real-time. So on one hand, I think the biggest challenge that we have is actually beginning to push the narrative of connectivity as a right, as against something that is luxury. If we want to develop Africa, we need to start to think of how do we reduce the price of getting connectivity to serve real people. And we've seen cases where people will tell you that people in rural area are not connected, but some of these guys still use Facebook, right?
Oh yeah.
Because there's a compelling reason for them to be on Facebook. So they find a way to use it, right? My mom is probably over 80 and she's still on Facebook, right? So you will find that still in Nigeria. A good example in Nigeria and in most African countries as well. Another good example in Nigeria is there's a final exams that you need to do before you go to the university. The government decided that for you to see the results of the examination, you need to buy a scratch card and go on a website and you log in on the website for you to see your result. The funny thing is that this is one of the most successful use cases of technology in Nigeria, because what people tend to do is people actually travel to the nearest internet cyber cafe, close to them to check their results. So you see that there's still that level of consumption. So I think on one hand, we always assume that once we build this thing in such a way, we're eliminating people. There's that fact. And I don't think we're going to completely take that away. There's that fact that we're going to eliminate. But I also think how we drive the case for further penetration of connectivity is by having strong business cases, right? Can we show that when you build these solutions that can reach much more people because connectivity is strong, that it adds value to the economy? Once you start to show that, then you start to also make case for why we need to invest in last mile. Why do we need to make sure the cables get to where they need to get to? At the minute in Africa, a lot of the services that people in the remote areas consume, they're not connected. So there's no economic value tied at the minute to connecting them. And what we're doing is alienating them. We're still serving them with services that are rooted in the way we did things 15, 30 years ago, which is not what they need. They want to be connected to opportunities the way each and every one of us is connected to opportunities. So Sean, I may not be answering your question in the way you want to hear it, but I think the biggest problem is how do we make sure that connectivity becomes a right?
Right. I think, really hearing that message loud and clear, actually. And I'd like to just in the remaining minutes, maybe just come back to Kamal on this. And maybe Kamal, if you want to respond on that idea of, like digital access as a right. I know that you've got, like in my notes, I know that you've worked on this Mojo Chat project offer. And I wonder if there's any kind of links there between the kind of digital skills perspective that we're talking about as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, one of the things that, since I have moved sort of to a different part of the world, one of the things that I've been asking myself a lot is around, what kind of skills are we really talking that will get you sort of economic growth, your own economic growth, right? And one of the interesting things that we found is, your ability to communicate. I've seen this, it's actually, so, I've seen this a lot of times when I used to hire in Kenya, both at Safaricom and IBM. And, I have people standing in front of me who, when I look at their code, it tells me much more about them than when they speak to me. Right, but your success oftentimes depends on your ability to actually say the right things, or connect with me, so that after 10 interviews a day, I still remember who you were in a crowd of people who I interviewed, right? And it's something along those lines, but that we're trying to understand. So I'm using both technology as well as humans to help develop a service that can help you to improve your communication skills, both for like very specialized circumstances. I'm also starting to talk to a few organizations now in developing regions and universities to see how we can apply it there. But I just wanted to also come back to that point earlier. See, there is, I think what's really important in this, and this is why, I've always been sort of from afar an admirer of what Bosam's work was, and also when I see the tenacity of the iHub guys, when I had the luxury and the fortune to lead it for a short period of time. It's amazing because it's because you're continuously trying to add something new. Right, you're continuously observing what's going on, and you're changing course, or you're adapting to whatever those environmental things are telling you. This is, I think, also for M-Pesa. It's not like M-Pesa today, or any successful service today, is very different from 10 years ago. Right? If it were still the same as it was 10 years ago, it wouldn't be as successful. Right. So when you look at, today, when I hear the story of CC Hub, then there are two comments that I can make. The first one is it actually clarified something else for me. I remember in Kenya, we always had that discussion, was iHub first or CC Hub first. Bosom now confirmed that it was the iHub who came out first. So I'm very happy about that. The second thing is, but when you look at the story, right, and also from AfriLab, so it's too bad that Kundu cannot be here, right? I've looked into AfriLabs and spoke to a few people 5 years ago. Today, it's a completely different organization because it's adapting to the changes that are happening, and you're finding new ways of engaging. What I think Bosam just described as one of the things he is doing at CC Lab with sort of the public health sector, we've never thought about something like this, an approach from a hub perspective 5 years ago, 4 years ago, right? These are new things that will strengthen the innovation resilience, what we were talking about, tremendously, and I think accelerate in a very short time frame of the interest of people to come in and contribute and help us establish these kinds of infrastructures. I think it's really this continuous evolution and movement that like for anything, when you're hitting diminishing returns, you have to give people something new. And that's exactly the same process here.
Thank you, Kamal. I'm really disappointed that we've run out of time. I had so many more questions actually that I wanted to ask you guys and to get your opinions on, but we're just about done for the session now, so we're going to have to draw things to a close. Just from my on my behalf, thank you so much for such an engaging conversation, for really, interesting presentations and a really good lively debate afterwards. And I'll hand over now to my colleague Andrea to close out the session.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you again to you, Basan, and to you, Kamal, and also to Kunda, if he's out there. Just to say, again, this session on multi-scalar linkages is wrapped up our week of thematic sessions as part of the Global Ideas Exchange series. I invite everybody to join us for the Global Ideas Exchange Summit next Thursday, October 29th. You can register with the link that's in the chat box. Just to say that we've decided to postpone our fireside chats until mid-November. So those were originally scheduled from Monday to Wednesday of next week, and they'll be a little bit later. But with that, I'll wrap up the session. And again, just a huge thank you to everybody joining us on YouTube and then on the panel as well. Thanks.